This Family Life News podcast is made possible by the support of listeners like you.
No matter where you find yourself politically, I think we can agree that the escalating outrage and disrespect on every side is exhausting, and there's a case to be made that it does little to represent the good news of Jesus Christ. But what can we do about it? Well, welcome to Family Life's Inside Out, where we talk about how God transforms his people from the inside out. I'm Martha Manikas Foster, and today to talk about outrage culture and how we might show respect and honor for people different from ourselves is podcaster, consultant, former pastor, as well as former mayor of Midland, Texas, Patrick Payton. His new book is titled The Middle: How the Quiet Majority Can Mend a Divided Nation. Welcome to Inside Out, Patrick.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be with you. I look forward to our discussion.
I do too. So Patrick, you've been a pastor and a mayor and now a podcaster, a consultant, and a book author. You have a lot of perspectives. So with all of this in mind, talk to me about outrage culture. What do you see? How do you describe it? What do you believe are the costs?
Well, what I believe are the costs of it is if we're talking to a group or an audience who describe themselves as followers of Jesus or people of faith or Christians, I think the damage we're doing is Christians and Christian culture is actually beginning to sound a lot like the outrage culture. And quite frankly, I would trace that back. I'm old enough to have been raised in the church in the 70s and the 80s and remember some of the countercultural protests even in the 60s and 70s and on into the 80s and things that gave rise to the moral majority. And I think there was this shift that took place where people who did not uphold a certain moral framework that some of us appreciated or liked, that we thought was wicked or we thought was bad, we made this shift to forget that even though these people might be offending us, even though they may not be living to what we believe to be a high moral standard that we hold to, we forget they were also created in the image of God. We forget that they were also loved indelibly and incredibly and eternally by God the Father, even if they've never experienced that love or known that love. And so whether they believe the same things I believe, the fact of the matter is, if I believe the Bible, then they also are created in the image of God. They also are deeply loved by God. And then we somehow lose sight of that. Our culture, and I believe myself to be a part of that believing culture, have been at fault of being enraged at people doing things I don't agree with, but not realizing I can disagree with what someone was doing, but I'm not allowed to disrespect. I'm not allowed to disregard. I'm not allowed to dishonor. And the reason I begin with that is because if you get to, the book of Matthew and Jesus' teaching, he says, you're the salt of the earth, but the salt has become tasteless. It's good for nothing anymore except to be thrown out and trampled under the feet by men. And then within a chapter, he says, by the way, I know you guys, and I'm paraphrasing, he says, I know that you all think you're supposed to love your friends and hate your enemies, but I'm going to switch that on you. I need you to love your enemies and do good to those who persecute you. So I think sometimes we got to take a look inside. And before we start looking at an extremist left or an extremist right culture who disrespects without discussion and dishonors without honor, we also have to look inside and say, wait a minute, am I praying a prayer that says, God, help me to see people the way you see them rather than the way people are being caricatured in culture? So I think it's sort of preaching to the choir first. And so it's a long answer to say, I think the culture of outrage sometimes has its start in some of us who are inside the church rather than outside the church.
Yeah. Well, that's an indictment. That's something really to think about. Now, Patrick, it seems to me that with each new headline, and they've been coming at us quickly, a lot of Americans' reactions have been immediate. And speaking to what you've just been saying, our reactions are frequently based on our allegiances, aligning ourselves with who we consider to be our team, before taking the time to see these issues through what we say are our core convictions. Now, if that's the case, and if you want to unpack that for me, what is it going to take for us to pause after we read a story or a post or hear something on the radio? What is it going to take for us to take the time to question how humility and faith in the redeeming power and work of Jesus Christ might guide our reactions instead of us going for, well, I'm on this team and this is this team's reaction, so it's my reaction?
Yeah, great question. And I think that, once again, if we go to the scriptures, and many people are not going to like what I'll say in this regard, Jesus has his own team. His team is neither an R or a D, and I know a lot of people will push back against that. I know that there are certain things that are held and certain things that are believed, but in the end, Jesus is the team, and political parties are not the team of Jesus, and both sides use Jesus for their arguments. But more to your question, I would say, I have this rule with email that I practice with people I consult, and when things get frustrating and when an email seems angry, we teach people to practice the 24-hour rule. Never respond to an email unless you give it 24 hours to marinate. And then take the time to write the email you think you're going to write, and then go ahead and delete it and rewrite the one you should write. And I think as crazy as that sounds, one of the worst things we do is we react and we post and we respond too quickly, and that's not wisdom. James, in the book of James, talks about the wisdom from above and the wisdom from below in James chapter 3. And one of the things he says about the wisdom from below, and in the Greek language it reads, it's full of electioneering and politicking. It's literally the translation.
Wow.
And so if we think we're being wise, which wise is not being right, wise is having the right perspective, maybe one of the things we should do is, again, go back to the book of James, to James chapter 1, and count it all joy that we're experiencing all these trials. And then he throws in this amazing piece where he goes, so pray for wisdom. And when you really dig into wisdom is really understanding. It's perspective. It's having the right perspective. And we just have to use an old phrase, slow our roll and realize that a reaction is not as good as a response, and make sure that my response is in line with how am I viewing this person. And to take it further, usually we're responding to people that we have an already predetermined opinion about because of media or whatever the issue might be. And I have to back myself up again and say, wait, that is a person created in the image of God. I am supposed to exhibit love, and I don't know their story. So am I responding to an issue or a person? And it's just this holistic approach. I had to practice this probably more as a mayor than as a pastor.
Okay.
Let's take COVID, for instance. I had people multiple times when COVID started happening. I had a group of medical practitioners come to me and say, hey, if you don't shut the city down, and this is literally the quote, you're going to have 2,000 dead people on your hand in 3 months, and you better buy refrigerated trucks.
Oh.
And then quickly on that, I had another group of people who would tell me, if you shut the city down, you're no better than a communist or a socialist, and we don't want you to be the mayor of our city. And it's then when I realized what was happening then is what's happening with the extremes of our culture. Both sides seek to control and manipulate through fear. And what my job as a leader, and in some senses you might say the pastor of a community facing the unknown, was to slow down, pray, get perspective, and realize that people are reacting out of fear. Now I've got to react out of wisdom. And if the movement of followers of Jesus who are fed up with the right and the left, who all seem to all be yelling at the same tone, then we're the ones that have to return to the salt of the earth and return with a tone that goes back to what we said at the beginning of this conversation, a tone that says, I want to see you the exact same way that God sees you, the exact same way that Jesus sees you. And when I look at the New Testament, I never see Jesus lashing out at a person unless they're a really religious person, because he really goes after the Pharisees and Sadducees. Right. But when a woman at the well shows up, he's filled with grace. When a woman washes his feet, he has words for the religious guys in the room. So it all circles back to, we better get back to these founding principles of these are people created in the image of God. And if you want to even go to our founding documents, we all believe that we have been created and are gifted with these inalienable rights. So that's maybe a longer answer than you wanted.
No, lots to think about there. Kind of piggybacking on that, from your perspective, what do you see as the next steps forward for Christians and Christian churches if we want to live out this call of Jesus Christ, if we want to slow down and listen, react more because the person is made in the image of God, even if the person doesn't call on Jesus Christ as we know God to be? If we want Jesus himself to shine brighter through us than the way, as you said, there are caricatures, right? Jesus has been characterized on both extremes in different ways. If we want to shine out the Jesus that we know to be the true Jesus, how do we do that? How would you say would be good first steps?
Yeah, well, I think, number one, pastors from pulpits need to start reminding people that as nervous and as uptight as we might tend to get on the Christian side about what we see in culture, if we really believe that the God of the universe who created the universe, if we really believe his word and what he says in his word, not to be pithy, but Jesus wins in the end. Mm-hmm. And so we need to keep that in mind. And we also need to keep in mind, if we're the kind of people that like to say that God is in control, then we have to rest in that as well. So that we have to combat our fear that's really unfounded if we profess ourselves to be followers of Jesus and to be filled with his peace. Right. And the second thing we have to do is it's an old phrase someone taught me years ago, and I don't remember who the first person was who said it. We have to realize the enemy, capital E, enemy, mm-hmm. is the enemy. People are not the enemy. Now, I know that's hard when you watch certain things on TV, when you see people say certain things, when we live in a global environment where we see evil. I'm not saying there's not good and evil, but in the end, evil loses, Jesus wins, and we have to allow that to marinate within us. And then we have to approach this idea of, am I actually more broken for people, or am I more angry at people? And those two cannot coexist.
Oh my,
so
yeah.
I have to once again stop myself and say, wait a minute, before I lash out at fill in the blank, before I make a statement about someone in my Bible study that everybody's going to laugh at and say amen because I ridiculed somebody, mm-hmm. am I more broken for what they don't know, or am I more angry for what they seem to be saying, what they seem to be doing? Again, those cannot coexist. I have to be able to see people the way that Jesus sees people. And there's another tremendous passage in 2 Timothy chapter 2 where Paul outlines how we're supposed to conduct ourselves and how we're supposed to have discussions, basically when we're out in the watching world. And he talks about being able to teach with great patience. And it's this incredible list beginning in, I don't have my Bible in front of me, but beginning in about verse 20 through 25. And I hope nobody says, well, see, he's a false teacher because he doesn't know where it is. It's 2 Timothy chapter 2.
Right.
He goes through how we're supposed to be patient with people and how we're supposed to be kind. And then he says this amazing phrase. He says, it just might be. And then after he says it just might be, and this is all answering the question, how do we respond?
Yeah.
If I react to people and respond to people the way it's outlined for me, beginning with love, going through grace, walking in humility, then, only then, does the door open. That's why that passage is so important. It says it just might be that God will open their eyes. The literal language says they might become sober and be rescued from the trap of the enemy. Well, when I look at that as a follower of Jesus, then it reminds me, wait a minute, if my words and behavior are out of anger and spite towards people that are making me angry and I'm fearful of, then I'm actually closing the door to God moving in people's lives rather than opening the door. Now, that doesn't mean I don't get angry. It doesn't mean I don't get frustrated. It doesn't mean that I may want to have a temple experience and feel like I'm going to take a whip and run everybody out of the temple. It just means capture the thought, submit to the Spirit, and see if you're going to have the Lord renew your vision of love towards people and reminder that Jesus wins. And that's why I think there's a vast majority of this country who are watching the extremes, who know that this anger is really destroying us, but they just, especially in the believing community, are going to have to get back to a biblical-centered anthropology. You know, people used to complain to me about people living in sin, and I said, if they don't know Jesus, what do you expect them to do?
Right.
And so why am I so angry? And I get it. We're angry. We see things on TV. I've seen them. But I have to slow down and say, hang on a minute. Let me quickly just tell you a lesson I learned when I was pastor.
Sure.
It was early on in our church. I was there ultimately for 18 years. We had an amazing run, great church, and we were probably about 2 years into our church start. We started with about 50 families. When I retired, we had about 5,000 people coming to church every Sunday. And I was making a derogatory statement, a moralistic derogatory statement about a particular famous couple who was a lesbian couple in the media, but I referred to them from the pulpit as perverts. And a lot of people nodded their heads, you know, and said amen because I was ridiculing this wickedness. And I had a young man come to my office later that week. He was a friend of mine, and he was someone who had actually come out of a life of homosexuality, and he said, can I just talk to you for a minute? And I said, sure. He goes, I don't know how you're going to receive what I'm saying, but do you know that if anybody was sitting in the congregation or anybody hears your taped message who is struggling with that issue, you just hijacked the gospel by calling them a name. So I got up in the pulpit the next Sunday and I apologized to the entire congregation for how I dishonored people created in the image of God, even though they're struggling. Mm-hmm. That's what it all comes back to is, do I see them as God sees them?
Mm-hmm. And it is amazing. It is amazing that the God of the universe, creator of all things, has trusted his gospel to fallible humans like us. And the purpose of our lives is to be living in such a way that people do ask, what is the reason for the hope within you? And if we're outraged, and if we're outraged all the time, yes, the people around us who think the same way or feel the same way we do will say, go for it, amen. But it doesn't reach out at all to someone who either feels diametrically opposed to us or who doesn't know which way to think, but now knows that we're outraged, right? We're outraged. We're not people of peace. We're people of outrage.
Right.
Wow.
Right. It's just like Paul to the Athens, I see what you're looking for. And let me talk to you about that. We're losing the opportunity to have a conversation. And I remember, when I was in seminary back in the late 90s, one of my professors was Dr. Richard Land, and he was very involved in politics. I remember him making a statement. I didn't understand it at the time. I was in my 20s and maybe didn't have enough insight. And he said, it's going to be a dangerous thing when Christians hitch their wagon to a political party. And I was a little bit idealistic, and I thought, oh, no way. Jesus is a Republican. He's not a Democrat, even though all of my Christian family back in the 70s were yellow dog Democrats, right? If anybody remembers that.
Yeah.
And it becomes dangerous, like we said, when we claim Jesus to be on our side, because then the other side claims something about Jesus. And you said it already. Do they see our good works? Do they hear our good words? And then are they willing to ask a question about the hope within us? And, I was on another radio show. This was several years ago while I was mayor. It was a call-in show. I did it every 2 weeks, and people were calling in, and they were referring to Nancy Pelosi and other people with these very derogatory statements. And finally, I just stopped in the middle of a phone call, and I said, let me just stop here for a minute, because so many of you people are claiming you're Christians, and you end these conversations with God bless you. I said, but I don't see anywhere in the Bible where I get permission to refer to someone who's created in the image of God in a derogatory term or with a ridiculing name. Well, you can only imagine the phone calls stopped coming into the radio station, but something had to be said. And there's nowhere in the book, there's nowhere in this conversation where we are telling people, turn a blind eye to what is evil. No, we're not doing that.
No.
But the enemy is the enemy. There is good. There is evil. There always has been. Jesus wins. But in the end, if I believe that God so loved the world that he gave his only son, then am I more broken for their lost condition than I am angry for their political position.
Let's end on that beautiful sentiment for us all to be thinking about. Thank you. Thank you, Patrick, for this conversation, for your book, and for joining me right here on Inside Out.
Honored to do it.
My guest has been consultant, former pastor, former mayor of Midland, Texas, Patrick Payton. He's the author of the new book, The Middle, How the Quiet Majority Can Mend a Divided Nation. I'm Martha Manikas Foster with Inside Out on Family Life.
Thank you for listening to this Family Life News podcast. If you've been encouraged by what you've heard, please share it with others and click the subscribe button to automatically receive future episodes. Family Life is a listener-supported ministry. Podcasts like this are made possible by your financial partnership. Find out more at familylife.org.